been a while since I've done one of these recordings. I just had a realization about how our society got to where it currently is. Highly sensitive, highly agitated, and highly irresponsible as it pertains to self-responsibility. People are living in heightened, fragile emotional states, and they're making those around them responsible for how they feel and why they got to feeling the way that they feel. Let's go back. So you have the generation of the baby boomers. As far as I know, that's when generations started to be named. Let's say it wasn't the generation of the baby boomers, and it wasn't the generation that raised the baby boomers. It was the generation that raised the generation that raised the generation of the baby boomers. You see, 2 generations prior to the baby boomer generation, that generation was solely focused on survival, even though civilizations and societies had been built, and are still being built up and were thriving, I suppose you could say. It was a great state of war. And the people of that time were highly focused on their own basic well-beings for survival, as I said. So they didn't have the mind, they didn't have the emotional capacity, emotional capacity, and they didn't have the physical availability to really cultivate their home and family life, and also their self, their sense of self, their inner well-being. They didn't have time for this, and not only did they not have time, energy, or the attention to devote to these aspects of their life, it was not socially allowed. What was highly enforced and encouraged socially by their societies at those times was the needs of the society. So building and upkeeping the societal standards and the societal expectations for their country and their culture, no matter what country or culture you're a part of. Because this was a time when the great powers of the world were still coming into formation. So what happened is that their children grew up with an absence, with the absence of that essential component to their overall development, that inner cultivation, the cultivation of their inner selves. Not only were they denied it because their parents were denied it, they were also whipped into conforming and adhering to and upkeeping the needs of the society. So there was no self. And so in the societies and cultures and countries where it was allowed, where they could still have that sense of self, it wasn't a collectivistic culture, it was an individualistic culture, they would simply demand it of their own accord. And so going from 2 generations prior to the baby boomers, going to 1 generation prior to the generation that raised the baby boomers, this generation became highly focused on self in a demanding way. The society won't allow me to have myself, so I'm going to demand it in whatever way that I can. And that is when I believe the epidemic of mass narcissism really began to unfold. And so the generation of the baby boomers was raised by a generation that had not been allowed to have that sense of self independent of society, have that say, have those wants, have those desires, really focus on their true needs. And so now they were demanding it, and anything and everything around them became a means of them satiating their own needs, their own wants, and their own desires. And thus, this style of upbringing and guiding children to develop began where it was solely up to the children to supply all of their needs outside of the very physically basic things such as food, shelter, clothing. It was up to the children to supply their own emotional needs. And those very inner needs and desires for development of their own accord, and to get it by any means necessary, any means possible. And so the narcissism, or I really don't want to call it narcissism because of the DSM-5, that is still a psychological disorder, more specifically a personality disorder. And so I want to call it this, I will just call it egocentrism for now. This very egocentristic way of parenting and guiding the next generation to develop began. Yet by the time we reach the Gen Xers, a shift came into society where they saw, the children of the baby boomers saw that they needed more than what had been given to them. They needed help. And so they decided to seek this help outside of themselves. And this is when the sensitivity started to make its way back into our societies in a way that became like a virus, where it started off small. Oh, let's give all the children medals. We're all winners. We're all winners. Everyone deserves a medal. And then it began to fester and fester and grow and grow. And so now that we are where we are today in 2019 with Gen Z up and coming, and my generation, the millennials, taking over societies, everything is hypersensitive because of that neglect that occurred way back during the times of our civilizations and society, where we were really pressed for survival because of the wars and the discord among us. And no generation had discovered the tools to teach to the up and coming generations, or a generation at least, because we deal with one generation at a time. Let's just say that socially we do. How to do their inner work while integrating themselves into the external environment that surrounds them. So the inner work has to do with the internal environment. And the external work has to do with the external environment. And when one does their internal work, the external work is automatically done. It's automatically done. And this is what was either not realized, or perhaps neglected, or perhaps ignored. And so thus we as societies, as the human race, have gotten ourselves into this, what I will call a societal crisis, because we, in our focus of building up the external environment, we fail to realize that the most precious commodity of this external environment, our societies, is us. And we neglected that very essential component, where if you do not cultivate the sense of self or allow it to be cultivated, the society that is run and built by this collective of selves will be run to the ground, will be run to destruction, will be run to chaos and mayhem. And now we've reached a point in our societal existence, or how do I say this? The existence of our societies, where it's unavoidable now because we've reached our threshold of tolerance. Every society is at its peak and it's overflowing with chaos, with emotions that have gone unprocessed, unacknowledged, unrealized, and now they're flowing out of control. And yet, as a society, many are still unaware. And so now we are being brought to this awareness, whether we want to or not, in an involuntary way. The time of great social awareness, which as a result means a time of great inner awareness as well. It's the great inner awareness that's bringing us to this great social awareness. Fascinating. That's simply it.